What we see of the Ghanaian culture and political structure is that we have a monarchy, maybe constitutional, maybe absolute. We have noble families, a merchant class that's not considered notable in universe, a burgeoning mechanized industry, military forces that have the form of a professional standing army, but are also left to loot their wealth, and a large rural class that has little contact or in common with the centers of power and economy. If you consider the question, what is Garnia, it will be a hard one to answer, not least of which because despite the numerous disparate cultural elements written in story, there's nothing explicitly written as to what values the Ghanaian nation stands for. We can make educated guesses as to their political and socio-economic structure. The presence of a monarchy, wealthy noble families, and an unremarkable merchant class points to some possibilities. The land that's called Garnia in story may once have been divided between rival feudal ruling families, competing with each other for ownership of land. Then, at some point, their rulership coalesced under a single monarchy. The mention of ancient Tellurian culture and works points to the presence of an ancient, perhaps classical empire that in time split up into different regions, Garnia among them, in a way similar to the real-life Roman Empire. And the mention of horse lords also points to a later encounter with a culture of horse-riding conquerors, much like the real-life Mongol Empire that threatened Europe. Thus, in broad strokes, the region inhabited by Garnia, Vinsalia, and Brundheim may have a similar history to our real-life Central and Eastern Europe. Indeed, reviewers and critics of the book called it Ruritanian, which fits the definition of a vaguely Eastern European region still dominated by wilderness before mass industrialization further changes the land and the society. As for the character of the Ghanaian society, we get a perspective from Burnett at story's beginning, as he's arguing with a tradesman as to the differences in Garnia and Vinsalia that justifies their disputes, fueling their war. Notwithstanding the metaphor of religion or politics as differing footwear, Burnett speaks of Garnia as monarchist, and the Vinsalians as royalist. At first reading, this feels like a distinction without a difference, as Burnett's recitation of national propaganda can't be taken at face value. A monarchist system of government is, by definition, ruled by a monarch, and a monarch comes forth from a royal family, while a royalist system of government advocates for monarchy, which requires a royal family. Yet more can be read into Burnett's description of the distinction between monarchist Ghanaians and royalist Vinsalians. The line goes that a monarchist benefits commoners with wisdom on the basis of noble birth, while a royalist usurps power, wealth, and visits other heinous offense against commoners. Again, this feels like a distinction without a difference because, as far as a peasant class is concerned, a ruling monarch is free to be good or bad to them. The main difference comes in the relationships between the monarch or the peasantry and the rest of the noble ruling class. In a feudal system, the peasants would be ruled by a local monarch, and his family, by definition, would be considered royal. When former competing feudal states come together under another greater monarch, the families that used to be monarchical unto themselves would likely still be considered royal in that they're noble, and still retain some privilege and title, but now as part of a larger state. The difference comes whether the new greater monarchy is empowered and thus empowers in turn the former peasantry or the nobility. It's possible for a great monarch to come to power if enough of the peasantry rejected their feudal lords' rivalries in favor of a greater nation-state. It's also possible for the feudal lords to give up some of their power to a greater monarch in favor of an oligarchical state. The end result may look similar from the outside, with a monarch, nobility, and peasant class, But the more intricate relationships make all the difference. A monarch empowered by a nation of people, even one kept down as peasants, may in turn empower those same people to grow beyond being the labor for noble classes, by fostering community and national services that increase the education and skill of the populace, opening the door for expanding technology, industry, and economy, and allowing for classes of merchants, tradesmen, professionals, and artists. The alternative is that a greater monarch empowered by the nobility may in turn empower that nobility to better ensure their wealth being generated by the peasant class, such that no advancement of technology or industry goes forward without the patronage of the nobility. Certainly nothing that would challenge the economic and industrial or military power of the nobility and their title. The story itself, however, doesn't give us a glimpse into the more nuanced or detailed relations between the classes, much less how the monarch empowers or is empowered in turn by them. We can deduce from Burnat's sophistry that Garnia, or whoever has the most influential voices in Garnia, has crafted a narrative that the monarchy of Garnia is good and righteous for empowering the people to find prosperity, and that the Vinzalian monarchy is evil and debauched for oppressing their own people for the benefit of the few and noble. We don't know the truth of this narrative, and it's entirely possible that the narrative is completely divorced from a more mixed reality, where both benefit and oppression were given monarchical or royal sanction. Nonetheless, there may be some truth to the idea that the people of Garnia have benefited more from their monarchy than the nobility have, at least in the minds of the nobility themselves. We get an unforced and possibly unfiltered view of the presumed privilege of nobility in the attitudes of Lord General Fearon. When Burnat goes to speak with his uncle, the Lord General, for the first time, his uncle laments that he is not personally given the credibility and authority he thinks he deserves, but instead the blame for the failures of the Garnian war effort. The technicality that he is himself one of the primary architects of the war effort is of no apparent concern to him. A distant secondary priority to the maintenance of his mustache is that he is looked upon favorably by the Garnian printed media, if for no other reason than as an extension of his privilege as part of the nobility. When we see the other characters interacting with him, he shows no concern other than maintaining his hostility towards his presumed enemies. First Josette for saving a battle he failed to win, and then Burnat for blackmailing him to let Josette keep her command, on account of his failure to detect and counter a Vin invasion. Fearon shows no concern for actually utilizing his knowledge and skill to better serve Garnia's military aims, and is instead more concerned with validating his worth by virtue of his noble blood. An extension of this is when Burnat returns, nearly successful in his mission to get Josette discredited, that he offers Burnat a command himself, not with concern to Burnat's actual military qualification, but only in respect to his noble blood. As the failures of Lord General Fearon in Garnia's military campaign demand their own discussion, what we can infer from his time and story is that there may be a general attitude among nobles that their nobility is sufficient to give them success in serving Garnia, and by extension, themselves. But this is belied by the preoccupation with the opinions of Garnia's broadsheets, whose disapproval seems to trouble them more than an actual enemy army come to conquer them. This might indicate that, however highly nobles in Garnia may view themselves, the editorial authority of the printed media has a significant power to influence that of the nobility. Whether the broadsheets are privately owned or government-owned, supported by a broad base of subscribers or wealthy patronage, the class of nobility that Lord General Fearon belongs to may be on the decline, such that the enterprise of Garnia's printed media holds more credibility for their readers, in public and in government, than that of Firen's noble blood. Whatever the nobility and military hierarchy feel or willingly admit, the view from the officers and soldiers fighting the war, as seen through Josette's eyes, paints a picture distinctly lackluster. Despite having supposedly not lost war in 3 generations, a statement both dubious and possibly vague enough to be true in the right context, the Gharnian military suffers from, as a list, shortages of equipment, shortages of experienced officers, shortages of manpower, and shortages of training, such that women have to go into the industry, the signal corps, and the logistics corps. Also, men could be sent to fight, but still only half-trained. If we take the view that the state, whether vested in a monarch or a broader ruling class, requires its military to be sufficient to satisfy its military and national goals, at the very least national defense, then we should expect the Gharnian authorities and influential figures to look at the situation and rightfully push for a reorganization to better foster and promote merit in combat, war, and logistics, such that the army may be sufficient or even proficient in the state's goals. Why then should the Gharnian army, as written, be in such a declining state? One possibility is simply the attrition of constantly being at war for about 10 years over a neighboring region and ostensibly for its natural resources. Gharnia wants to occupy and exploit the mineral wealth of neighboring Quay, but so too do Vinzelia and Brunheim. So they've been taking turns fighting wars or skirmishes for control over that region. While Gharnia may have won control for a time, it's written that the effort has caused a decline in military readiness. Gharnia keeps losing personnel, and no amount of industrialization or abundant mineral resources can make up for that. It's one reason stated in story that there's been a drive for employing women in every military or industrial role other than combat to make up the shortfall, especially over the objections of traditional nobility and military leaders like Firen. Josette herself has a view of how a professional army might operate, and if Gharnia ever has such a military, God help the rest of the world. Alas, what we see of the Gharnian military is a mixture of professional military units, more local garrison units, and militia whose standards of equipment and weaponry may be far below par. The one time we see these mixed units in battle is in the defense of Arles. That concludes the story. In addition to how little time the units have for mustering and deployment, not to mention the creation of fortifications and defensive lines, the outnumbered Gharnians rely on their artillery to make up the differences in manpower and their proficiency. Yet were it not for the perception, foresight, and direct intervention of Josette, her crew, the airship Mistral, and the other airships of the Aerial Signal Corps, the artillery and inexperienced units would have been defeated in detail. The Gharnians could not afford to lose what little power and force multiplication the artillery provided, so the loss of just a few may well have lost Gharnia the battle, and by extension the city of Arles itself. As Josette supposed, all Vinzelia has to do is march over the scattered defenders, block the rail transport hub besides the city, and threaten the center of Gharnian power so that they can exact a high price for peace. We should think that Josette is not uniquely qualified to follow that train of logic, that the vulnerability of Vinzelia invading Gharnia through Arles would be something to plan and prepare for, given that the battle at Story's End is not the first time it's happened, but the second time. The story begins in the aftermath of the first time Vinzelia invaded Gharnia, by going to Arles, and we might think that particular avenue of invasion would be well and truly fortified lest Gharnia's enemy Vinzelia try it again. What truly might be holding back Gharnian military effectiveness is not simply that they're running out of equipment, not simply that the personnel they muster to fight aren't competent or properly trained, Not simply complacency that Garnia has not lost a war in 3 generations. I can hypothesize that the top military and government officials who have staked their nation's reputation on this war are not only complacent, but perhaps likely don't have a stake to lose in it. Try to imagine your community is in the path of an invading army. You may not have any particular quarrel with the people of that army, but an army doesn't operate based on who has a problem with them. They operate to serve their nation's larger goals. Whatever those goals, as far as you're concerned, if your community is on the path of invasion, your life, the lives of your family and friends, your livelihood may very well be at stake. And in this world's Napoleonic warfare, killing for the sake of temper and for loot is done very easily. There are at least 2 choices then. You can try fleeing, or you can try to fight. And having everything you've worked for and held dear lost to the invader can be a powerful motivator either way. For government and military officials, the stakes can be high as well, for not only would they be targets for death from the invader, if they're placed high enough, they're also a target for captivity, whether for ransom or interrogation, to give up state and security secrets, making their conquest easier. And it all contributes to making your nation lose power and prestige. Military occupation is not done for the benefits of the locale or the populace, it's done to benefit the war effort. And seizing what's valuable for an army, mills, grain silos, even people's homes, are not an obstacle for an invader who is fully justified in taking power and wealth for the prestige of their nation. For high-ranking officials like Firen not to be more motivated in preserving their state, their territory, and their prestige until an invasion is almost directly on top of them indicates that maybe Firen and other nobles like him don't have much to lose should the war go poorly for Garnia. It's possible that the relationship between the Garnian monarch and the nobility, and by extension the military, is based on those nobility being given further wealth and prestige in exchange for supporting the monarchy. We can only guess what the nobles would have wanted from the monarch, but whatever that was, it wasn't delivered on. So in the minds of the nobility, neglecting the national defense of Garnia would send a message to the monarch of their discontent with their rule. And if the nobility felt their title was safe from enemy invasion, distant and likely better protected, then I can easily imagine officials like Firen defecting to the Vinzalian invaders, not just to protect their lives, but also to protect their title in exchange for giving up the protection of the Garnian military, the state, and the monarchy, leaving Garnia, army and populace, to the mercy of Vinzalian rule. The negligent nobility of Garnia may very well prefer a change of monarchical management if it means they get the wealth and privilege that was unfulfilled under the current king. To me, at least, it's not so much out of the question that nobility would essentially sell out the Garnian nation, because properly defending it from imperial competition would certainly be expensive, not to mention conquering and occupying a mineral-rich and highly contested region over the course of 10 years. We can see this in the tendency of both civilians and common soldiers to extensively loot the dead, or presumed dead, of whatever valuables happen to be on their person. For the soldiers, it indicates that they're not paid enough for the hazards they face, and the skills they gain and retain to survive the combat. If this trend pervades most of the professional standing army, or even the local garrisons, it is an environment ripe for betrayal. Agents of Vinzalia can offer bribes for intelligence, sabotaging both equipment, and sowing discord in the military command. Any number of noble military commanders, vain and self-serving like Firen, would be a gift to their enemies. As Bernat was able to play on Firen's vanity and insecurity, in the face of blackmail by hearsay, so too can an enemy agent play on that same insecurity to help secure Guardian defeat, however far that insecurity goes in the military command. Of course, whatever urgency and peril is perceived upon the advance of the Vin army into Garnia, we don't have any indication that Vinzalian rules are meaningfully different from Garnian rules. We get a sense of this mostly from Josette's recollections from her time back in Durham. Josette recalls the words of her father as to the past importance of Durham, that it was an important center of trade between Garnia and Vinzalia, conducting commerce, trade, and travel, that even the horse-born, Mongol-esque enemies turned to conducting trade caravans through Durham, that it was so profitable. These are the words Josette recalled from her father's description of Durham in its past. Depending on her father's reliability as a narrator, it may be from the more distant past or never have been at all. But there is an interesting idea to glean from these notions if we take her father's past words at face value. Durham's importance may have predated the borders between Garnia and Vinzalia. Around Durham there is shown a great wilderness that is considered impassable to armies, barring a great effort to cut through the wood, that may have made Durham part of a narrow choke point on the path of travel between the two regions that would become Garnia and Vinzalia, making it an important place for people to stop and trade. It would be even more important a settlement if it was a useful center for harvesting wood and game from the surrounding forest. The combination of pervasive travel, convenient trade, and woodland resources close at hand would indeed help Durham grow fast and wealthy and important. So, what would have changed to deplete Durham of its vibrancy? At some point in the past of the story's world, Garnia took control of Durham and enforced a border close at hand. Additionally, at some point thereafter, the woods around Durham were made into king's woods, meaning only the monarch and royalty could hunt and harvest from them. Enforcing a border by Durham may not have been too detrimental to the town, as the point of Durham may have been built on the impassability of the surrounding wilderness, especially to enemy armies. But the exclusion of harvesting the forests to anyone but the king may have done more damage to Durham than any army possibly could. Come hostilities between Garnia and Vinzalia, Durham would see no trade, and no goods from the forest would come to make up for this. Durham may have been important by way of trade and local produce, but a hard border between hostile nations and the formation of king's woods may well have ensured its demise. It may not have been in the distant past either. When Burnett notes out loud how Josette hunted in Durham, she answered, "It was a long time ago." It may have referred to her presumed trespass, but alternately may have referred to the fact that she was hunting in Durham's forests long before the king made them into king's woods. Essentially, it might have seemed the king had stolen the woods from her, and by extension Durham itself. There are two concepts in economics concerning the harvest of common resources by a population. The vastly more well-known tragedy of the commons, and the seldom explored tragedy of the anti-commons. The well-worn definition of the tragedy of the commons is that a resource may be depleted if the people took their fill. The tragedy of the anti-commons is that a resource excluded to all but a few, or one, leaves the people as poor as if they had depleted the same resource. Durham itself seems to be a casualty of the tragedy of the anti-commons. Indeed, Durham may not be a unique example of a settlement affected by its integration into the local nation-state. After Durham falls to the Vin invasion, Josette and Mistral stop over at another town lying before the advance to destroy a strategically important bridge. The town is itself noted as nondescript, with its most notable feature being that very bridge, presumably built by that world's classical ancient empire, the Tellurians. What's notable is that while the town is currently Garnian in story, the general disposition of the townsfolk is that when they hear of the Vin invasion, their first notion is that they have no quarrel with the Vins. From the standpoint of the national military and upholding your nation in general, this seems to be a dense notion, because an invasion is by definition not based on a single quarrel, but is part of a larger goal of the nation that launched it. However, this notion does make sense if the culture and sense of history of that little town is that it predates the founding of Garnia, and that its relationship between the peoples and regions of present Garnia and Vinsalia is more fluid. If we suppose that Durham was important as a singular path through impenetrable wilderness, before Garnia and Vinsalia carved a border and then closed it off for their war, that little town with the classical ancient bridge may have been one of many different settlements where people from both regions regularly intermingled without friction. Instead of two great nation-states battling for dominion of land, resources, and people, the people themselves made settlements and had relations independent of singular sovereign centers of power. Also, if the town's culture is based on its history going back to that world's classical ancient period, then the passing of that culture may have taken away its place as part of an empire and replaced it with a sense of being part of an undivided congregation of settlements, simply making their own way without a single sovereign power to adhere to. In the words of modern international relations, this non-exclusive relationship between settlements is called pooled or shared sovereignty. Instead of expanding and enforcing hard borders that must be adhered to for the power of the centralized state, whether a town or city, state, the settlements freely associate in many smaller ways, as come to their attention and as they see fit. Instead of homesteaders competing and especially fighting to hold and close up as much land as they can handle, competing claims may instead call for mediation or agreed upon arbitration, so there's no need for conquest. It would be a viable alternative to more settlement-centric warfare or tribal warfare, especially if the ability to wage war was not widely taught or enforced in the region. When Garnia and Vinsalia were then founded in the past, it may have been under the auspices of feudal lords coming together to raise a monarch, raise a centralized military, and create a more centralized state that enforces borders, behind which a singular sovereign power would be served. Whatever the course of history and story, from that little town's perspective, a new border and order would have been imposed from without, limiting their free association to the surrounding settlements in an unprecedented change. In Garnian claim territory, for example, every Vinsalian would become a trespasser, whereas before, they were as welcome as any other. From this point of view, it would not be that people violate borders, but that borders, and their enforcement thereof, that violate people.